So we are really proud to introduce you to our new executive director, Sherry Duggar, who will be doing the next presentation on storytelling. Sherry has nearly 2 decades of experience editing magazines and books. She now puts that media and public relations experience to work in the agriculture field. Sherry has served as executive director of both Women, Food, and Agriculture Network, as well as Indiana Farmers Union, and as a Midwest outreach consultant for Earth Justice and a policy and communications consultant for America Grass-Fed Association. She co-chairs a national coalition, U.S. Farmers and Ranchers for a Green New Deal. She is also an advocate for local and regional food systems, diversified family farming. She frequently lobbies at the Indiana State House and on Capitol Hill. Sherry is also a member of the National Agricultural Advisory Council for the Humane Society of the United States, and she reestablished the Midwest Sustainable Agriculture Working Group in early 2019. Sherry is currently pursuing a Master of Public Health degree from the University of Indianapolis. And when she's not working, studying, or traveling, she enjoys life on her small farm with her husband, Randy, in Morristown, Indiana. And their dogs, cats, donkeys, goats, alpacas, chickens, and honeybees. So as I mentioned, Sherry has a great background with journalism, and let's listen to this workshop, which will be beneficial to both organizers as well as communities.
Thank you for having me, Maria. I really appreciate all the work you've done for this event, and it's a blessing to have you on our SRAP team. So as Maria mentioned, I have a background in journalism, and I have given many workshops and presentations on storytelling, and worked with a lot of farmers, food producers, community organizers on telling their stories and creating change through narratives. So why don't we get started with our slides and we'll go from there. So this presentation is called The Power of Story to Create Change. If you want to go to the next slide. As Maria mentioned, I am the Executive Director of Socially Responsible Agriculture Project. I have also served as Executive Director for Indiana Farmers Union, for Women, Food, and Agriculture Network, and done some consulting work for American Grass-Fed Association and Earth Justice and several other organizations, looking at food and agriculture from many different aspects, including environment, animal welfare, family farming and independent family farm support, lots of different aspects, but they all essentially are working toward the same goals. So let's go to the next slide. So storytelling. What is it about storytellings that connect us? We can tell stories to one another. We do it every day. We do it through multiple different ways. We do it through song, through poem, through social media posts. All the time, we're talking to one another. We're trying to connect with them. So stories can establish your expertise. If you're an expert in something, a food producer, a farmer, if you have a experience within your community, that instantly makes you an expert in your own experience. So stories can help to establish that expertise and sort of put you in the position to be able to teach others around you through your stories. Stories also offer you control. No one else can tell your story better than you. And so I would encourage all of you to work on your stories, to tell your stories again and again and again, and to understand that if you're not telling your story, it's possible that someone else is. And so this gives you control to make sure that your narrative is out there. Next slide, please. So those pesky little facts. I do a lot of storytelling presentations and talk a lot about facts. The fact is that we don't pay attention to facts in society today. Oftentimes we believe stories and we connect with stories through that social connection between human to human, and that is greater than truth or facts. So oftentimes also repetition of stories will make us believe a story more likely, even if it's not true. The repetition of a story, of hearing it over and over and over again, will make us believe a story is true, regardless of whether it is. My husband once was talking to someone about politics, which is a big topic, obviously, these days. And the person he was speaking to, actually, my husband said something about, statistics. And this man actually said, I don't do statistics. And so we have to realize that in today's, atmosphere and society, people aren't paying attention so much to those types of details, to the statistics. They follow stories and narratives based on their beliefs, on their passions, on their opinions. So we have to think and tell stories in a way that we're working to change their minds, and facts and statistics. Those things aren't going to do it. We are truly, unfortunately, living in an us versus them society. So you need to think of a story or a narrative that's going to connect you to this person instead of pit them against you in some way. We have to look past the ways we're different and think about how we actually are the same. So next slide. So how do we get others to engage? What makes people act? What is it that what you can tell in your story that's going to get them excited, get them inspired to work with you, to be engaged, and to join you? What it is the habit of the heart. What is their habit of their heart that also matches yours? Is there something where you can connect on a belief, on a belief in the quality of life for rural communities, on the strength of rural communities, on the tradition that you've grown up with, that you've lived with? What are those things that connect you to each other? And how can you get them engaged in your effort, in your community effort, based on those tiny connections that you might share? So what do people care about enough that will make them act upon it? Think about that when you're crafting your stories, when you're repeating your stories, when you're talking to people. That's what's going to get them to engage. Next slide. So the roadblocks to good storytelling. Oftentimes when we're working in food and agriculture, I see this over and over and over again. We oftentimes get quite literally caught in the weeds. We get too far into those details. We use jargon that people might not understand, and we oftentimes aren't clear about the goal. We don't remember to actually ask people what we want them to do. So these three things are roadblocks to good storytelling. If you think about it, if you go down a path and you start telling a story and someone doesn't see the end, they don't understand why you're telling them the story, or you go off on a tangent and you go into a lot of different details that they might not understand. You use words that they don't understand or that they don't use regularly. What that does, a good story is a painting. And what that does is that stops that painting, that stops that story right in the middle. And they don't understand what you're saying. Instead, they're thinking about, I don't understand what this person is talking about, rather than listening to you, getting inspired, getting excited, and really thinking about how they can become involved in what you're talking about. Next slide. So these are some of the words that we use every day in my work with SRAP. We talk about CAFOs. We talk about environmental justice. We talk about food justice. We talk about local food systems. All of these words aren't necessarily in the vocabulary of mainstream society, of regular people who are living their lives and working outside of the food and agriculture system. So this, you have to consider, these words that you see here on this slide are considered jargon. Maybe people don't understand what a CAFO is right away. Maybe they don't understand what the impacts of a CAFO is. They don't understand why local food is important, or why, pollution exists and what's causing it, and why biogas is a dirty energy versus, pasture-based animal agriculture that can actually sequester carbon. So we can't talk about these stories in using these words unless we want to completely confuse our listener. We have to think about what's important and why we're connecting with them, and tell them these stories in such a way that they understand and they essentially go along with us on the journey of the story. And we walk along with them and tell them, essentially teach them what we've learned through our own journeys along the way. Next slide. So I'm a journalist. These are the basic tenets of journalism. If you read a story in a magazine, in the newspaper these days, a lot of the stories that are online, what you're going to be reading within those first few paragraphs of that story are going to include these W words up here in the H and who, what, where, when, why, and how, and sometimes wow. So if you think about it, those are the things that you learn at the beginning of a story when you're reading a magazine, when you're reading a newspaper, when you're watching TV and seeing a news report there. They're going to tell you who's doing something. They're going to tell you what they did, where they did it, when it happened, why they did it, and possibly how they did it. And then if there's that wow factor, that's something that's going to really hook you into that story. And it's an exciting piece of that story. So those are the basic tenets of a story. And you will see that in anything you watch, anything you read, anything you listen to in a podcast, etc. So what I've also diagrammed here on this slide is the, essentials of any story. And if you think about this, say like in a movie, in a love song, anything that you get a narrative from, there's going to be a hero. You're going to have a hero set up into this story, and you're going to go along on this journey with this hero. That hero is likely going to encounter a conflict in that story. There may be some suspense. There may be some, excitement, sadness, depression, anything that can happen with that conflict. And so what you have to do in this story is you have to be able to resolve the conflict. It might not be something that actually gets resolved in your story, but there's a way, there's a path that you're going to present to the resolution of this conflict. So if you have a problem in your community, this is happening all around you. You are the hero. Other community members who are fighting this conflict are the heroes as well in this story. You have to resolve that conflict in some way in the narrative and show your listener or your reader how this conflict can be resolved. And then you want to reflect on why it matters. Why is your story important? Why do people need to care? Why do they need to join with you? Why do they need to take action because of this conflict that exists? Next slide. So some of the keys to a good story, the hook. Whenever you start a story, you can walk up to somebody and say, like, true story, I got to tell you something. Okay, that's a hook. That's something that's going to get their attention, that's going to get them listening to you. You can do that on social media. You can do that in person. Like, hey, listen, this happened to me. You want to tell your story with energy. If you're not talking with energy, if you're not talking with passion and excitement, why should they have passion and excitement about your story? You want to be authentic. If somebody stops believing you, they instantly stop trusting. So you have to be authentic. You have to be real. And you have to make sure that your audience is going to believe you and trust you. As I mentioned, you want to have a basic structure and you want to have a good reason. So the basic structure is going to help your listener or your reader see the end. As I mentioned, you want to make sure they don't get lost in the details. They don't go down paths that they don't need to go down. This basic structure is going to keep that narrative really simple, really easy to understand, and they're going to see your point. Next slide. So how to make your details stick. You want to name the person. Who is that hero that I mentioned? What's the reason for your story? Why are you talking about that person? Why do they matter? And in communities who are organizing or who are opposing something, it could be you as the hero. It could be a consumer who's the hero. Consumers can go buy their food differently and change how food and agriculture, how our system is run today. The environment can be the hero. Truly, we have to save the environment and we have to fix things that are happening with our climate problems and pollution, et cetera. Animals who are involved in the food system can be heroes in the story. We can, think about how we want to save them or how we want to make sure that they have better lives than what they might have in certain situations. Children really, truly are the heroes in lots of stories, especially in food and agriculture, because we're trying to leave a better world for our children. And so a lot of what we talk about, even though we may be talking about agriculture and pollution or different things like that, what we actually care about most of all is the world that we live in and the world that we're leaving for our children. So use your senses whenever you're telling your stories. The 5 senses are a great way to make your stories memorable because humans learn and remember through their senses. And so this will actually make the story more memorable. Use those details, your hero, the conflict, the why, and your ask, and you'll have an easy to remember story that will leave somebody ready to engage. Next slide. So this is actually a long post that I put on social media. I don't expect everyone to tell stories like this, but I want to tell you a little story about Tegan. And this is Tegan. She was, I believe, 7 years old, if I recall correctly. So I went and gave a storytelling presentation. Tegan showed up with her mom. And her mom, I've never met Tegan. I knew her mom. And her mom introduced her and said, Tegan wants to be like you someday. I was like, I don't even know Tegan. Why does she want to be like me someday? So she explained to me that Tegan wanted to go into journalism. and that Tegan also loved animals. So I was like, okay, Tegan and I are instant buds because we share the love of animals, and we also have a belief and a passion for journalism. So I am a journalist by trade from my past life before I got into food and agriculture. So I understood what she meant by that. But what I didn't understand about Tegan, I came to find out through this workshop and what I told in this story on social media, which was essentially, I thought, Tegan's younger. She's probably not going to be too engaged in the workshop that I was about to give. So I tried to offer her some markers and some paper to color while we were doing our workshop. Instead, she politely told me no. And she said that she wanted to actually participate in the storytelling workshop that I was giving. And what she did throughout the entire workshop for 2 hours was not only participate, but she stood up, she wrote stories. She told stories to the crowd. She explained that she was very knowledgeable about who her legislators were. She explained that she cared about women's rights. She explained that she cared about the earth and what happened to the earth based on what the food and agriculture system did. And in reality, what Tegan did was completely surprising. She completely made me feel like I had misjudged her because I thought, this is a little girl who's just going to color while we do our storytelling workshop with the adults. And really, she was shining. And she has you can't see them in this picture very well, but she has little gold stars on her crest. And so through this post that I put on social media, I talked about this. I talked about what Tegan's, was showing me about her knowledge, about the world around us, about her legislators, how she understood the importance of voting and taking part that was her civic duty. And so it was really an amazing experience. And at the end of the story, I ended up admitting essentially that instead of Tegan wanting to be like me, I wanted to be more like Tegan. So if you'll go to the next slide. This slide instantly, it got a lot more reactions, but within probably a couple hours, this had 200 plus reactions, likes and loves, lots of comments and lots of shares. And some of the comments from people who read this story were saying, I want to be like Tegan one day. This is parenting done right. I love it. And one person said, Sherry, Tegan, and Anne, who is Tegan's mother, are the women I aspire to be for myself and for Everly, which was the daughter of the woman who wrote this. So what you see here is Tegan as the hero of the story. And actually her mom also was the hero in the story. And this inspired other people to be like her, to act like her, to parent their children like Anne was parenting her child. And so you see a hero and you get people engaged in the story and they're connecting through their heart. They're connecting through their humanity. And they want to be like these people that they've just read about. Next slide, please. So through that story, Tegan was the hero. And there was also an unspoken hero because the way I wrote it invited the reader into thinking they too could be a hero. I didn't say it. I didn't suggest that they should also be a hero like Tegan or also a hero like Anne. What I did was encourage them through telling the story about Tegan and Anne. There were embedded messages. I was talking about Tegan knowing who her legislators were, understanding, pollution, those types of things, understanding the importance of taking care of our earth. Those are embedded messages that people will learn and take away from that story and remember and hopefully do something differently because of those messages in that story. The hook was in the story, I started out saying, essentially somebody wants to be like me. There was the way I started it was I am misjudged. And it was just a sort of a short statement that people were like, what's she talking about? Who's she misjudged the story? So the problem, the conflict or the suspense point in that story was the fact that I had misjudged her. I started that story right away with the conflict because I really essentially admitted I screwed up when I met Tegan. I didn't know her. And I thought she was just going to be a little girl coming into color while her mom took part in this workshop. What are the points of connection there? They were all over the story. So people could connect with Tegan if they perchance had a young daughter like Tegan, or they wanted their children to be like Tegan one day. They could connect with Anne as a parent, raising her child on a farm. They could connect with me for my love of animals or my love of journalism and telling stories and that sort of thing. There were lots of different ways they could connect through that story and picture themselves in that story. So what that story did was start with an idea, which was that I misjudged Tegan because she wanted to be like me. We went on a journey, learned about Tegan through the story, learned that she was very engaged in her community, very knowledgeable about the environment, etc. We returned to the idea that Tegan wanted to be like me. And then I ended it with a twist, which was, in fact, I want to be like Tegan. So there was just this pathway. We took a journey. We saw a hero. We understood her. We related to her, and we came back. And at the end, we actually realized we wanted to be more like Tegan than she wanted to be like us. So the implied suggestion or the ask there is also, again, not really spoken, but is, encouraging people to think differently, to act differently, to raise their children differently, to acknowledge the children, bring to the table so much that we might overlook. Next slide, please. So there you go. Name the person, the reason for your story. It was little 7-year-old Tegan. Show her. I showed pictures of her, that little plate that she's writing on, or the notes that she took for her own stories that she told. I engaged our senses through that. I talked about what she was wearing, how she spoke, what we heard, those types of things. And we were talking about much more than data. There was nothing in there that had to do with statistics. There was nothing in there that had to do with facts. It was all experiential. It was all just my day spent with Tegan that day. Next slide. So I always put this list up. I come up with these words all the time. I basically threw this slide together just off the top of my head. These are similar to the words we saw on a previous slide. But I always ask people to think about, what are their 3 main stories? What are the things that they want to talk about all the time? What are the things that are most important to them? So when I'm talking to farmers, it might be regenerative agriculture. It might be, farm to table and the importance of using local food. It might be family farming or conservation that they do on their land. It might be soil health. So there's a lot of different issues out there. There's a lot of things that we're talking about whenever we're talking about food and agriculture. So I would ask you, what are your 3 main topics? And so if you'll go to the next slide, I'm going to then ask you, what are those topics and how can you forget the jargon? How can you get past the words that we just saw on the previous slide and drill down to the end result in each of those stories, which is your why? Why do you do things? What drives you? Why do you want to tell the story about regenerative agriculture? What's important about soil health? What's important about conservation, or the reason why, industrial agriculture has impacts on rural communities or economies? What is important to you and why does it matter? Next slide. So this actually says less, not more, or something. I forget what it says on the slide, but don't tell everything on the first date. So say less, and that can be more. Details. Think about like the connect the dots that we used to do as children. Those are details of a story, and you want to allow your listener or your reader to connect the dots to see the picture, the bigger picture, without you necessarily telling them what the bigger picture is sometimes. Allow people to come to their own conclusions. Give them that power to do that when they listen to your stories. Go to the next slide. So speaking of power, oftentimes whenever I give speeches or I give presentations, talks, I ask the crowd, how many of them know somebody who feels powerless in their job? Or how many of them think that voting doesn't matter? Always in the audience, the majority of hands will raise. They feel like they don't matter in their jobs. A lot of people feel that way. A lot of people have friends and family members who feel that way, or friends and family members who refuse to vote because they believe their vote doesn't matter. So what we have to do, and we've been socialized to believe that throughout life. So what we have to do is essentially re-socialize people to make them understand how much each one of us does matter. Our voice matters, our experience matters, our story matters. And we throughout history have seen the impact of people telling stories, of people gathering communities together to oppose different problems in their communities. And we see how they can actually create change and they can actually make a difference in their world and in their communities. So your audience matters, and you have to, through your story, not only tell the story of a hero, but help your listener or your reader understand that they are a hero too, and they can engage and they can create change. Next slide. So, changing minds, we want to offer people a community to join. When you watch any commercial on TV, when you're looking at a commercial for Nike or Adidas or any other brand, what they're doing is they're offering the consumer a place to go and a community to join. If you buy these tennis shoes, you're going to be like a bunch of other people who love these tennis shoes. If you use the Apple phone, you're going to be like all of your friends who use the Apple iPhone. So what you're doing is offering them a community to join. You want to be transparent about what you're asking. You don't want people to feel like you're getting one over on them or you're trying to be slick or sly. You really want to be transparent, authentic, trustworthy, and welcoming to bring them into your community. You want to be specific, and you want to make sure that you don't forget your ask. Oftentimes we'll tell stories, but we don't really get to the point of why we're telling that story and what we hope people will do to join with us. Next slide. So bringing communities together, we always want to think about no blame, no fear, no shame. This isn't an aspect of our society today. There's a lot of blame going on. There's a lot of fear and there's a lot of shame, unfortunately. But what we want to do is we want to go from the me in a story quickly to the we. How do we communicate with each other and how do we connect with each other through our hearts and through our humanity to bring people into our communities? We want to create a space, as I mentioned, that people are excited to join. Next slide. So good communication. It has, as I mentioned, simple, clear messages, lots of repetition. You want to think about who else in your group, in your family, among your friends and peers can also be a messenger of your story. Don't just tell your own stories. Think about who also can work with you to repeat those stories and tell them over and over and over again so that people remember these stories and actually start to act on them. I forget what the number is, but I think it takes about 21 times to hear a story before we actually take an action based on that story. So we have to tell things over and over and over again for people to understand us, to understand what we want from them, to believe in us, and to believe the truth of what we're saying based on our story, and then to actually engage and act. So you need to figure out who is on your communication team, who are your allies, who are your partners, what are the organizations you can work with, what are the other community members that you can work with to help tell these stories. Next slide. So these are words to live by. A good story is clear, it's concise, consistent, and it will stick with you. Those details, those sensory details will stick with somebody and they will remember that. So craft a good story and tell it again and again and again, and you can change your community. And oftentimes you can change the world by telling those stories and getting people engaged to create change. Next slide. So your take-home assignment after watching this, I hope you will go home and write stories or speeches about your 3 most important issues. What are your whys? Not the words that you saw on the slides prior, not the hunger or the conservation or the soil health necessarily, but why, what drives you to do what you do each day. Memorize those stories, talk about them everywhere, and repeat them over and over and over again. Next slide. And that wraps it up. I am Sherry Duggar, and I'm the Executive Director of Socially Responsible Agriculture Project. There's my contact information. Please feel free to contact me. We are always available to talk with you as community members and to figure out how to help you and support you and empower you in your work. So thank you for having me on this SRAP Live event, and I hope to hear from you soon. Thank you very much for having me, Maria, and I will let you take it back from here.